This presentation is devoted toward a simplified overview of verb form uses. And because I'm a teacher, I'm going to do what teachers do and start with some disclaimers and qualifications. So first, this is focused on the relative functions of verb forms in general. There's other functions of each of these forms, but these are what we're going to focus on is what is relative between comparing the functions of each form toward the others. And this is a limited and partial view of the verb form system. Basically, it's limited to this relative comparison, and it's partial, again, because of the other uses of the verb forms in Biblical Hebrew. So, more positively, the focus of the Venn diagram that we'll look at is to get at what Venn diagrams are good at, what is distinct and what is overlapping when we compare the verb forms together. All of this is merely a step on the way toward discourse analysis. But first we need to understand the basic functions of the verb forms in sentence grammar before we can take the next steps and apply them to discourse analysis. Well, let's begin by focusing on the sort of the binary distinctions between the perfect form and the imperfect form. Now, with the perfect form, we have sort of an outside view of the situation of the verb as a whole. Namely, we typically default to past tense, and that's just to look at the whole thing as a whole, but that's really a function of context. It's the past tense. There's no tense in the verb form at all. Rather, if the verb is embedded in discourse, for example, it often has a durative or a continuing or sort of a present tense form. So it really depends on where the verb form is placed. The imperfect, on the other hand, has more of an inside view of the situation as a process. And so our default will be future tense, but of course there are all of these sort of hypothetical possibilities, especially as this is embedded in discourse. For example, we have to ask, do we need one of the modal terms like could or should or would or the like? So in other words, it's not always just a declarative or factative sense of this will happen, but this could happen or would happen or should happen and so forth. So there's some basic differences between the two, but of course what we're focused on here also is an overlapping function between how these verb forms can be used. Now, in addition to the main two forms, there's two other forms that we need to think through, and that is the vital form, or the vav consecutive imperfect, and this is the narrative tense. So when this form is used, this really carries the narrative along, and that's its main function, and it's a very dominant form within narrative syntax. In addition, there's also the vakatal, or the vav consecutive perfect. And when we have the vav consecutive perfect form, this of course has more of this relative continuation, either of an imperfect sort of a future sense if it comes after an imperfect verb, or if it's after an imperative, then it carries with it that sense as well. So you'll notice then our Venn diagram has several overlapping elements already, even when we consider the first 4 main verb forms. Now we add our 3 minor verb forms, the imperative and the related jussive and cohortative, which has some overlap with both the Verb consecutive and the imperfect in certain respects of how it's used, and also the participle, which has both its distinct function as a noun, but also an overlap with the imperfect in its verbal use, or the infinitive, again, in its verbal use. And then the infinitive is really just, right, the abstract verb idea in general. Now, what not to get hung up on is why all these circles on the Venn chart are exactly where they are. All that's important here is just to notice the relative relationship between the forms and overlapping functions with other related forms. So while each of these forms has a distinct function, one of the ways that the Verb consecutive imperfect overlaps with a perfect is they can both relate to things that happened in the past. And so it depends on context how that works. Now with the perfect and the imperfect, these both relate when they're, especially when they're embedded in discourse, for something that's habitual or a continued sort of an action or state. Now, of course, the imperative, jussive, cohortative, these deal with commands, which also can be shared by the imperfect in certain senses, because the imperfect, especially when it's negated, is going to give a negative prohibition or some kind of a positive command as well. And likewise, there's sort of a contingency or a wish or desire for what could, would, or should happen that is shared between the imperfect and the jussive cohortative, but also this sense can be carried forward by the Verb consecutive perfect. So sort of this is where this whole volitional sense is where these several forms overlap in their function. Then finally, the participle. Again, it can have this sort of verbal sense, and that's where it overlaps with the imperfect. It can have sort of this noun idea or adjective idea, but it also can be just in its abstract verbal sense, and that's where both the infinitive and the participle per se have that gerund, ing, sort of ending that we just place on the verb. Again, infinitives oftentimes will have prepositions attached to them, or infinitive or pronominal suffixes, which gives the infinitive its own distinct function. But the point here is to notice that there are distinctions and overlap in a very general and limited way between how the different verb forms of the verbal system function. A couple of other very brief notes are in order, and there's 2 other categories that we often think of verbs in. We can talk about action verbs as either dynamic or transitive, and when we speak about dynamic, it's a more general idea of describing actions rather than states. And when we speak of transitive, this is focusing on how a verb affects something, whether a direct object or indirect object. Now, dynamic would be juxtaposed over and against stative, where stative gets at a state or quality, and these verbs are often pointed just a little bit differently as well. So, for example, it's dynamic to say he fills, but it's stative to say he is full. Now, transitive, it gets juxtaposed over and against intransitive. That is, where transitive refers to how direct or indirect objects are affected by the verbal idea. Intransitive refers to verbal ideas which do not govern objects. So, for example, it's transitive to say, he guarded the house, but intransitive to say he was guarded. So, for example, all of the nifil forms that are used in the passive, they're all inherently intransitive. Here's two examples, one of a perfect, one of an imperfect, which illustrate the larger issue of how these forms are not exactly tenses, but have a larger function which depends upon context. So, Genesis 4:9 says, Vayomer Hashem el Cain, e hevel achicha. Vayomer lo yadati ha hoshamer achi anochi. Briefly, the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? And he said, well, it's negative, I do not know. And here's a interrogative marker. Am I the keeper of my brother? So notice the function here is, I want to get at, is of this perfect form, yadati. And here it's negated, so it's sort of irreal. I do not know. But that irreal or hypothetical sense is not in the perfect form itself, but it's carried by particles that are in the sentence. And because this is embedded within a discourse, and it's not part of the narrative or a commentary on the narrative, then what we have is this sort of continuing state. I do not know. Now, of course, this is a lie. He knows exactly what he's talking about, and the Lord will catch him in the lie in the next couple of verses. But the point for now is that here the perfect form functions for an ongoing or continuous state because it's not past tense, but it's rather the verbal idea as a whole, and context bears out how it functions in particular. And we'll focus on an imperfect form 2 verses earlier in Genesis 4:7. Va'ata timshal bo. This is part of the Lord's warning against temptation to Cain before he murdered his brother. Now, you need to master it, or need to rule over it. So here's our imperfect form. Again, this is embedded in a discourse, and so that's really going to be a large part of controlling how it functions. Now, in this case, Tim Shal, this is call imperfect to ms. If that's all we had is that word, we would say you will rule. But we're not saying that because this is part of advice. You should rule over it, but you need to rule over it. And so this is the Lord's warning of what is hypothetical, but what Cain really needs to do. And of course he doesn't. So it's irreal. It's so as part of the larger function of the narrative, it's something that should happen, but doesn't. So again, what these two things illustrate is just an illustration of the perfect function within a discourse, how it talks about an ongoing state, and an imperfect function for a volitional desire, how the imperfect can function within a discourse to talk about what should happen, not about necessarily what will happen. Both of these are pretty normal things, and context bears these out. The idea to use a Venn diagram comes from the book, The Grammar by Cook and Homestead, mine is very different than theirs. I don't use the verb forms the way that they do, but here I'm following Arnold, Choi, Walkie, O'Connor, and I also have interacted just briefly with Lambden. So these are the sort of verb form functions that I was working with in the very different sort of in a very differently arranged Venn diagram than that used by Cook and Homestead.